Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the first chapter in the book of Ruth. The author of this often overlooked book is unknown, but the human protagonist was a Moabite woman, and the events described therein take place around the year 1100 BM before Messiah. So this is towards the tail end of the Judges periods before Israel was ruled by monarchs, and the one who established the semi-permanent dynasty which would rule from Jerusalem, David, was the grandson of this woman. And so much of the events and the calamities, there was all host of troubles during Israel's judges periods. There were foreign oppression, there was anarchy, apostasy, rebellion, and apathy towards the spiritual matters which the nation of Israel was called to embody. But we also read of famine, and famine was often interpreted as proof of divine disfavor. So that being said, we're going to open with the opening verse when it reads, "And it came to be, in the days when the judges ruled, that there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the fields of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons." So once more, this occurs in the period of Judges towards the tail end, and famine was what motivated him to uproot from his town of Bethlehem, which ironically translates as basket of bread, yet they had no bread to give. And Bethlehem was also the site where David would be born, and also the Messiah. So Ruth is one of the 5 females who are mentioned in Matthew's genealogy of the Messiah in the first chapter. You can find her in the 5th verse. And of these women, most of them had somewhat of a checkered history. So the wife of Uriah was an adulteress. The lady described in Judges 2 was a Canaanite prostitute, and Tamar committed incest with her father-in-law Judah. So, but it just goes to show, and there are plenty of wicked monarchs in the Messiah's lineage, Manasseh and a few others. But it just goes to show that the evil ancestors do not necessarily produce evil people. And Moab was the nation. It was some 50 miles southeast of Judah in Bethlehem, and it was the nation which was founded by the incestuous liaison between Lot and his firstborn daughter, described in Genesis 15. That's how they came about, and they had been an enemy of obstruction when Israel tried to enter into the promised land. And this man, his name is Elimelech. We'll touch on that in the next verse, but he has a wife whose name is Niobe, as we'll soon read, and 2 sons of whose names we'll soon read. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to the fields of Moab and came to be there. So Elimelech's name translates as El is my king, but this man, he was walking by sight, so he wasn't living or acting as if Elohim was his king. And Naomi's name, we'll touch on that later. It's going to come up and be significant, but they stayed there for some time, at least until the famine ended. And Elimelech, husband of Niobe, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. So Naomi is a widow, and she's soon to be bereft of these 2 sons, and Ruth will be the only her daughter-in-law would be the only living family member, and the conception of her with a native Israelite secures her or prevents her disgrace because in Jewish culture, not having children or grandchildren was considered a disgrace. And Mahlon and Chilion also died, both of them. So the woman was bereaved her 2 sons and of her husband. So not long after, remember they were only there for a period of 2 years, the 2 sons followed the father in death, and this left Naomi destitute and bereft of any family members. And she rose up with her daughters-in-law and returned from the fields of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that Yahweh had visited his people in giving them bread. So in other words, the famine was over that had compelled them to uproot and move there. And so she was going to return because that was her native land, and Elimelech, in all probability, shouldn't have uprooted his family and left there, but it all worked out in the end. It was all providentially arranged, even though he was walking by sight and not by faith. 2 Corinthians 5:7. And she left the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. So her 2 daughters-in-laws, native Moabites, were with her on her travels back to the land from whence she hailed. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each to your mother's house. Yahweh show kindness to you, as you have shown the dead and to me." So the Moabite religion, remember they were descendants of Lot, who was Abraham's nephew, so they may have had their polytheism might have been slightly less maligned than the ones who didn't share such a lineage of those who had been impacted and related to Yahweh. But Yahweh was very much the Israelite national deity, although they held him distinct from all the pagan polytheists as the universal creator of heaven and earth, whereas the gods of just about every other nation were thought of as territorial or elemental gods. Their jurisdiction was essentially limited to a single location or a single element in nature. But the reason that she may have wanted them to return is, one, she has no biological descendants to take along with her, and them being there as Moabites would have could have added to her disgrace, because the Israelites were forbidden to intermarry with Moabites, although foreigners were certainly permitted in the Israeli community, provided that they were proselytes, which Ruth very much was, as we'll read in the 16th verse. "Yahweh grant that you find rest, each in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. So her daughters-in-laws, like her, is a widow, so she's asking the same thing that she would wish for herself, to find rest and to find husbands. She's too old to find a husband, so her entire hopes seem depleted, but Ruth and Boaz come to the rescue in that department. And they said to her, "No, we shall go back with you and your people." So they were determined to not abandon this childless widow at this point, with going back unalone, unaccompanied, because there was even though there were provisions in the Mosaic Law which cared for the widows, they were often the neglected outcast of society, and the provisions were not rigidly enforced amongst the covenant people. But Naomi said, "Go back, my daughters. Why go with me? Have I still sons in my womb, that they should become your husbands?" So she's well past the point of childbearing age, so there's no possibility that she can reproduce the 2 sons with whom they were formerly married to. "Go back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband tonight, and should also bear sons." So even though this story opens as a tragedy, it ends with a happy ending, of which we're obviously not going to have enough time to reach the conclusion of it today. But she is distraught and distressed, and rightly so, because she has nothing and is returning with no one. "Would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you shut yourselves up not to have a husband? No, my daughter, for it is much more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of Yahweh has gone out against me. So she's accusing Yahweh of inflicting her with her current affliction, her present predicament, and this is an act of faithlessness, but in spite of it, Ruth's faith more than compensates for her own lack thereof. And so she's asking them, even if I could bear children, what are you going to do? Wait 18 years at minimum before they're of age to be married, and so there's really no reason from her vantage point to join her, even though she could benefit from the company. And they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So Orpah was amenable to persuasion from the argument, but Ruth clung, and the word clung is identical to that which is used in Genesis 2:4 in reference to the indelible inseparability between a husband and wife as prescribed in the Edenic order. So she is very much attached to her mother-in-law, inasmuch as a husband should rightly so cling to his wife and vice versa. And she said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her mighty ones. Go back, follow your sister-in-law." So she's urging and encouraging her to follow the footsteps of her sister, who had showed some initial resolve to follow her and accompany her, but was ultimately won over by her argument to return to her people and her culture. But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or go back from following after you. For wherever you go, I go, and wherever you stop over, I stop over. Your people is my people, and your Elohim is my Elohim." So this confession of faith, which is one of the most beautiful in all of Scriptures, indicates a willingness to belong to the people whose rank she was not born into. So there was provisions for foreigners to become members of the covenant nation. This was contingent upon their conversion, and I think in Deuteronomy 23:3, the Ammonites and the Moabites were forbidden unto the 10th generation of joining the covenant community and participating in their worship services. So the great question, unanswered question asked is, how did Moabite like Ruth join that community? And it's an instance of the grace superseding the law. "Where you die, I die, and there I shall be buried. Yahweh do so to me, and more also, for death itself parts you and me." So she, the clinging of what she read of in verse 14 was quite literal. She was willing to do a death till death do us part arrangement, similar to what a husband and wife enters into at their marriage vows. She was so committed to her mother-in-law, she did not want to see her leave, abandoned and distraught without hope. She could provide that hope and was determined to do so by providing her with a grandchild. "And when she saw that she was strengthening herself to go with her, she ceased to speak to her." So the words evidently had an impact and an effect. So there was a greater counter-argument that she gave. "And both of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it came to pass, when they had come to Bethlehem, that all the city was moved because of them. And they said, 'Is this Naomi?'" Now, as a returning denizen and citizen of the hometown, she would have been instantly recognized and embraced with love and acceptance by people who had known her all her life. And Bethlehem, once more, was the site, the city, where the town where David and the Messiah would be born. And it's located in Judah. "And she said to them, 'Do not call me Niobe, call me Mara, for El Shaddai has dealt very bitterly with me.'" So Naomi, I think, translates into blessed, but Mara translates as bitterness. So she is rejecting the blessings and positive overtures of her people. El Shaddai translates as El Almighty, and once more she's ascribing and attributing blame to her present predicament and current dilemma to the man upstairs. I went out filled, and Yahweh has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Niobe, since Yahweh has witnessed against me, and El Shaddai has done evil to me? So this is a slight exaggeration. The entire reason she left was at her husband's behest, because they were not full. They did not have access to the food they would need to survive. Hence, they traveled some 50 miles to the southeast to the land of Moab, and she's asking, her name no longer has any meaning. Remember, names in scriptural context always indicate are more than the significance of the symbolism always is deeper than the surface. But of course, that's not the case in every case, such as Amalek, who El was quite clearly not his king, or he was not acting like a loyal subject of the one whose king he claimed. And once more, she's attributing blame to her dilemma to Yahweh, or El Shaddai, both of them, in fact. Thus Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the fields of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. This would have occurred sometime in the spring, according to the calendar, the barley fest, and I think Pentecost, or Pentecost, the festival of Pentecost indicated some transition from the barley to the grain harvest. I should really research that, but I didn't, and it's too late now. But this documents the travels where they had been. They had gone from Moabite, and Naomi at least had returned to Bethlehem, and Ruth would be transplant in Bethlehem. And this, once here, she, just a sneak preview of the remainder of the story, she secures a family redeemer by the name of Boaz, who marries her, and together they sire Obed, who is the father of Jesse, who is the father of David, who established the royal lineage and the semi-permanent dynasty, which would reign from the throne of Jerusalem until 586 BM, but from whose ranks the Messiah also hailed. So this is significant enough to earn its own book, as she was an ancestor of both the royalty, the royal house of Judah, and the Messiah himself, and as such, her story very much has a place in the scripture. And this book is, unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, often overlooked, but we're determined to give it at least some of the focus it deserves. So I'm glad you're here. Stay tuned till next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.